Did you marinate your brain on Tumblr? Do you base your understanding of complicated ideological concepts off of short internet posts and TikToks? Do you have a negative parasocial relationship with a fictional dragon queen and her family? Do you want to win an internet war with her stance once and for all? Great! Now you can put your skills to good use. Take some cherry-picked traits of that family, take the extreme ideology of which you have the most superficial understanding possible, and apply it to them, with a complete disregard of what it entails. Just dance on the graves of millions of people to the applause of your fellow progressive Tumblr mutuals with absolutely no consequences. Because you absolutely have to win against that 15-year-old girl by calling her, and by extension her fans, Nazis. Before we start, remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. Perhaps you find it ridiculous that we start the video with answering a question that should be obvious to everyone, but I find the answers to the question of what is Nazism to often be somewhat superficial, and I want to give a meticulous response precisely because it's this superficial understanding that leads people to make such ignorant claims. By itself, Nazism is a certain subcategory of fascism. Fascism is famously quite difficult to define. We can easily pinpoint the principles of ideologies such as socialism or liberalism, but it's harder to do this with fascism and Nazism. No worries though, we will not use that word Umberto Eco list. In fact, we need not define fascism to be able to define Nazism, at least for the purposes of this video. Intuitively, Nazism brings connotations with its genocidal anti-Semitism and the genocide that was carried out in its name, and while that is indeed a core aspect of this ideology, it's by far the only one. Contrary to a popular belief, anti-Semitism did not suddenly appear in the 20th century either. It is equally important to note that Nazism and fascism are both modern ideologies. That is, they only appeared and rose in prominence after capitalism was already introduced and cemented as the dominant mode of production. As such, there can be no fascism or Nazism in the feudal mode of production. And frankly, we could stop here given that Westeros is very clearly a feudal state, but let's continue anyway. The core belief of Nazism is the existence of a higher Germanic race, superior to the lower ones, collectively known as the Untermenschen, subhumans. While Nazism was most definitely white supremacist in nature, given its disdain for Afro-Germans, Nazi perception of race was different than how we conceptualize it today, so it's rather pointless to analyze it from the framework of whiteness, though who exactly counts as white isn't static in time and place either. Even people considered as white can undergo the process of racialization. It is perhaps easier for us to assume that the idea of whiteness was not that paramount to the Nazis, and that instead the groups designated as the Untermenschen underwent a certain process of racialization, but not in the most commonly used framework. And, of course, we must remember that even within the area of the Untermenschen, there was a clear hierarchy, with Slavs at the top and Jews at the very bottom. But for what purpose were the Untermenschen even designated as the Untermenschen? When discussing it, often it is made to seem like it came out of nowhere for no reason other than hatred and prejudice. And indeed, those were the core aspects of it, but the actual reasons as to why racialization of the Untermenschen even arose was completely different. Nazi race policy existed as a way to justify the colonial expansion in the East, known as Lebensraum, living space. Nazis believed that the Darwinist ideas of competitions between species applied to nations or races themselves. As such, the highest race, the Germanic one, could take the land and resources of the Untermenschen as their birthright. German expansion further east, and the so-called Drang nach Osten, the drive towards the east, were well documented before. The moment Germany conquered Poland, they annexed parts of its territory and its populations were expelled east, while German settlers took over the land and homes. One woman describes her experience as such. On 17 October 1939, at 8 a.m., I heard someone knocking at the door of my flat. As my maid was afraid to open it, I went to the door myself. I found there 2 German gendarmes, who roughly told me that in a few hours I had to be ready to travel with my children and everybody in the house. When I said that I had small children, that my husband was a prisoner of war, and that I could not get ready to travel in so short a time, the gendarmes answered that not only must I be ready, but that the flat must be swept, the plates and dishes washed, and the keys left in the cupboards, so that the Germans who were to live in my house should have no trouble. Because of generations of European anti-Semitism taken to the most extreme, Jews were the only people designated for complete eradication in the pursuit of the Lebensraum. In every other case, most would be eradicated, some deported, and some designated as slaves to the higher race. Plans for what to do with each ethnicity and nationality were documented in the so-called Generalplan Ost, the General Plan for the East. As such, it is not a stretch to say that the Holocaust was a colonial genocide. The word Aryan is often used in the context of Nazism as well. Under Nazi rule, the term applied to most inhabitants of Germany, excluding the Untermenschen, Jews, Roma and Slavs. Those classified as non-Aryans, especially Jews, were heavily discriminated against, and the final radicalization of Nazism eventually called for their complete eradication, the final solution. In the case Germany was victorious, near complete eradication of Slavs would surely follow. By itself, the term Aryan predates the Holocaust by thousands of years and was used to describe an ancient civilization of Indo-Iranians. The languages that the descendants of this civilization speak belong to the Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-European family. Those include languages such as Hindi. It is believed that they all come from the same source, Proto-Indo-European. This is why you can find many similarities in Sanskrit, an Indo-Aryan language, and European languages, especially with the Slavic ones, mostly due to geographical proximity. The term Aryan derives from Sanskrit and means noble, superior, or highborn. In Europe, the notion of white racial superiority emerged in the 1850s for the first time, and it was then when the term Aryan was used to describe the white race. The proponents of these ideas believed that the Nordic and Germanic people were the purest Aryans. Nazis, however, went a step further, excluding some white people from that definition and marking them for extermination to make way for their living space. The ideology of the higher Aryan race is linked to Nazi phrenology and is probably the most well-known aspect of Nazism aside from the genocidal anti-Semitism. We speak, of course, of the obsession with certain physical traits, most commonly found in those of Nordic or Germanic ethnicity: tall, blonde hair and blue eyes. While this was the ideal, not everyone who possessed those features automatically qualified as Aryan, nor did everyone considered Aryan had those features. Stereotypical images of Jews include them having black, curly hair, dark eyes and big noses, but that does not mean that all Jewish people look like that. There were Jews with Aryan features, and that did not spare them during the Holocaust. In the case of Slavs, Nazis believed that in certain specific cases, those possessing certain features can be Germanized. This is why kidnapping children with Aryan features was common and widespread during the war. These children were placed in residential schools, renamed, had their language and culture eradicated from them, and were later adopted by German families. When the Genocide Convention was being drafted after the war, it was this kidnapping that prompted its creators to include forcible transfer of children as an element of genocide, but it was far from the only instance. The same happened to indigenous children during the colonization of America, Armenian children during the Armenian Genocide, and many others. Alois Twardowski, a victim of this program, described his experiences in his book, Die Schule der Janitscharen. He was kidnapped from his home, renamed Alfred Binderberger Wellhartmann, and adopted by a German family. In the process, he repressed the memory of his biological parents and grew to consider himself German. After the war, his biological mother found him. Alois was initially in denial about all this, but eventually decided to go to Poland and meet his mother. It took years for Alois to accept his true identity. He eventually settled in Poland, dedicating the rest of his life towards reconciling the two nations. His story is somewhat inspiring, but the truth is, very few of these children returned home. There is a free documentary about this issue on YouTube by Deutsche Welle, following two siblings, one of whom returned and the other who did not. English subtitles are available. There are two things to note here. First, only children were eligible for Germanization. Two, the justification as to why these children had Aryan features was the belief that they had German ancestry. Germans have been living in Eastern European territories since the Middle Ages, and intermarrying was common, with some Germans assimilating into the dominant culture. As such, the Nazis simply saw this as reclaiming their own children, so to speak. Overall, simply possessing Aryan features did not make you Aryan. Being a member of the Germanic or Nordic nations did. Many of the most ardent Nazis did not look particularly Aryan, including the Austrian painter. Who was considered Aryan and who was not often depended on convenience as well. For example, Japanese people held the title of honorary Aryans since they were allied with the Third Reich, but even Slavic collaborators were not granted that privilege. Let's say that this entire ideology was quite contradictory. To sum everything up, Nazism was born out of the desire to colonize Eastern Europe, and that desire was born out of the belief that certain races or nations, Aryan ones, are higher than others. Nazis did have a certain fixation on blue eyes and blonde hair, but merely having those features did not make anyone Aryan. We might now try and apply what we just went over to House Targaryen. The most common arguments in favor of linking Targaryens to Nazism are as follows. 1. They have the suffix Aryan in their name, which is similar to Aryan. 2. They practice intermarrying in order to keep their blood pure. 3. Their features of silver hair and purple eyes bring connotations with Nazi obsession with light hair and eyes. 4. They believe that they were closer to gods than to men on the basis of their ethnicity. 5. They believe that they have the blood of the dragon, magical blood that allows them to tame dragons. Let's address the very first contradiction, the Aryan suffix. Already in the first book, we know that Targaryens were not the only inhabitants of Valyria, and later we are introduced to other Valyrian descending houses, Celtigar and Velaryon. Almost all Velaryons that we meet have Valyrian features. They presumably intermarried with each other, definitely intermarried with Targaryens, and believe in the blood of the dragon, though they were not dragon riders back in Valyria. In that case, why do only Targaryens have the suffix Aryan in their last name? Since all Valyrians had silver hair and purple eyes, all intermarried to keep the blood pure, and all talked about having magical blood, wouldn't it be pointless to single out only Targaryens, especially since they were far from the most powerful family in Valyria? Why not name the entire ethnicity Valaryans or Valerians? And in spite of all the negative connotations, Aryan is still a very popular name in India, Iran, and even Albania. Not only that, we have a character in the story named Arya, which is a feminine form of Aryan. Does that make Arya a Nazi? No, she simply has a name that derives from Sanskrit, just like Asha, Mira, and Sansa. The argument that the Targaryens are meant to be some sort of a metaphor for Nazis because they have a word similar to Aryan in their last name is about as strong as the argument that Arya is a Nazi because her name is similar to Aryan. That she does not have Aryan features does not really matter, considering that her ancestors did eradicate Westeros' indigenous people in their pursuit of Lebensraum and never once married outside of their own ethnic group. It's infinitely more possible that the Aryan suffix does not have any significance here. George simply joined several syllables that sounded nice, and it's infinitely more possible that he simply liked how the name Arya sounded. In the occupied zones and in the Reich proper, relations between Germans and those considered subhumans were strictly forbidden, as to not dilute the precious Germanic blood. That does not mean that rape and sexual violence did not happen, but those were not committed for reasons of reproduction, but as a method of terror, as most rape is. Long after the Holocaust, rape started being considered as a method of genocide, as observed in Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Bosnia. It's quite disingenuous to single out Targaryens as the only ones practicing intermarrying. Yes, they were the only ones to go as far as to marry brother to sister, but cousin marriages were incredibly common among the houses of Westeros long before the Valerians arrived. Ned's parents were first cousins. The Starks, in their 8,000 years of history, only ever intermarried with houses of firstman descent. When Robb chooses to marry Jane Westerling instead of a Frey girl, one of the justifications for his decision is that the Westerlings are of better blood than the Freys, since they are firstmen and the Freys are Andals. Does that make Robb a Nazi? No, it makes him a member of a feudal house. Marrying within the family was common during feudal times, since marriages were contracts between two houses that entailed exchanges. Marrying someone from another house meant that you needed to give something up, but intermarrying could prevent this. Of course, they did not know that inbreeding so much would cause their offspring to have deformities, and only discovered it long after they began practicing it. But we talk about a fantasy world, where genetics does not work the way it does in the real world. After centuries of inbreeding, the Targaryens should be more misshapen than the infamous Habsburgs, yet they looked quite normal, aside from those weird bears every once in a while, which literally prove that they do have dragon blood. They practice inbreeding to keep it, not to reduce the existence of those with non-Valerian blood. They were also not exclusive in thinking of themselves as superior on the basis of their blood, as demonstrated with Robb. In the entire history of the Targaryen reign, marriages outside of the family were actually more common than those within family. There were only 10 sibling marriages in the history of the entire Targaryen reign, and those were Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys, Rhaena and Aegon the Uncrowned, Alysanne and Jaehaerys, Alyssa and Baelon, Aegon and Helaena, Baelor and Daena, Aegon and Daenerys, Aelor and Aelora, Shaera and Jaehaerys, Rhaella and Daenerys. Many other Targaryens married people with non-Valerian heritage. Actually, why don't we list every single Targaryen marriage that was to a person who had absolutely no Valerian heritage? Orys Baratheon and Argera Durrandon, Maegor Targaryen and Cerys Hightower, Alice Haraway, Tyanna of the Tower, Elinor Costaigne and Jane Westerling, Rhaena Targaryen and Landroth Farman, Daela Targaryen and Rodrik Arryn, Daemon Targaryen and Rhea Royce, Viserys I Targaryen and Alicent Hightower, Rhaena Targaryen and Corwyn Corbray, Rhaena Targaryen and Garmund Hightower, Daeron II Targaryen and Miriam Martell, Daenerys Targaryen and Maron Martell, Elaena Targaryen and Ossifer Plum, Ronald Penrose and Michael Manwoody, Maekar Targaryen and Diana Dane, Baelor Targaryen and Janna Dondarrion, Valar Targaryen and Kiera of Tyrosh, Daeron Targaryen and Kiera of Tyrosh, Rhaegal Targaryen and Alis Arryn, Aegon V Targaryen and Beta Blackwood, Duncan Targaryen and Jenny of Oldstones, Daenerys Targaryen and Khal Drogo and Hisdar Zolorak. If we consider people who have more distant Valerian ancestry and all the affairs and betrothals that did not come to fruition, then this list would have been even longer. Let's do exactly that. Rhaena Targaryen and Alyssa Farman, Aemon Targaryen and Jocelyn Baratheon, Visera Targaryen and Theomore Banderly, Viserys I Targaryen and Emma Arryn, Aemond Targaryen and Alice Rivers, Aegon II Targaryen and Cassandra Baratheon, Aegon III Targaryen and Miriel Peake, Aegon IV Targaryen and Bethany Bracken, Jane Lodstone, Belager Oteris, Cassella Veit, Falena Stokeworth, Megget, Melissa Blackwood and Barbara Bracken, Elinor Penrose and Aerys I Targaryen, Daeron Targaryen and Olenna Redwyne, Jaehaerys II Targaryen and Celia Tully, Shaera Targaryen and Luthor Tyrell, Royal Targaryen and Ormond Baratheon, Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. Relations between Germans and those considered subhuman were straight up forbidden. If Targaryens are Nazis, then they are doing a terrible job in it. Looking at the list of all these relationships, we can see a strong increase in them after the dragons went extinct. Additionally, in the case of Jaehaerys' daughters, we see that only Alyssa was a dragon rider. All of this seems connected. Think about it. A Valerian dragon-riding woman marries into a non-Valerian, non-dragon-riding house. Her child will be a member of the non-Valerian house. All of a sudden, that family has dragons. Precisely that happened when Rhaenys married Corlys. Corlys was Valerian, but the Velaryons never had dragons, and all of a sudden they have two, and the biggest fleet in the world, and they are also uber rich. A recipe for disaster. I imagine that back in Valyria it was the exact same. If two powerful families joined, then they would have to share their dragons, hence they married within families. In A Clash of Kings, we learn that Karth has a custom in which the groom-to-be can ask whatever he wants of his bride-to-be's family, and they cannot refuse. Xaro wanted to use this custom to get one of Dany's dragons for himself. It works in much the same way. All of this has to do not with Nazism, but with the way feudalism operated. Another thing that can be explained by feudalism is the mantra of Valyrians being closer to gods than to men. Probably every single monarch or feudal lord in existence needed to devise such an excuse to convince the feudal serfs to accept their rule. Polish nobility in the Sarmatian times believed themselves to be a separate race than the Polish peasantry. Did that make them Nazis? No, it made them feudal lords. The Chinese emperors believed in the divine mandate of heaven. Did that make them Nazis? No, it made them feudal rulers. The Japanese emperors literally believed themselves to descend from actual gods. Does that make them Nazis? No, it makes them feudal rulers. European kings believed in the divine right of kings, claiming that their rule is mandated by God. Does that make them Nazis? No, it makes them feudal rulers. And here we return to the claim that fascism and Nazism cannot exist in feudal times. The ideas of blood superiority or blood purity existed before anyone even thought of these ideas, and they existed for entirely different reasons, and were not nearly as destructive as the ideology of Nazism. The Targaryens act like feudal lords because they were feudal lords, and they were not the only feudal lords. Every single house in Westeros is feudal and exploits its serfs. Yes, even the Starks and the Hightowers. Contrary to how some people try to make them into oppressed, downtrodden proletarians. Which they can't be because the proletarian class did not exist in feudal times. This is what happens when you try to LARP as a Marxist, but do not bother to read its actual principles. Having all of this in mind, let's address the blood of the dragon. There is certainly something to say about the genre of fantasy containing eugenical elements, for example, certain races in RPG being inherently less intelligent and more violent, or certain people having special abilities on the basis of their blood. A Song of Ice and Fire is one such example. However, instead of criticizing George R.R. Martin for utilizing such a framework in his story, or to engage in criticism of eugenics in fantasy as a whole, fans tend to assume that this is secretly a criticism and not him playing into tropes straight and scapegoat the Targaryens as Nazis as a result. Hardly anyone ever points out that Targaryens are not the only ethnicity to possess special abilities. For example, Varking and Greenside seem to only be reserved to those of the First Man ethnicity. A Song of Ice and Fire is not the only story to have powers related to one's heritage. In The Witcher, Ciri possesses Elder Blood, the blood of the so-called Elder Races, which gives her special abilities. In Harry Potter, magical skills are passed via blood, and even the Muggle-born wizards are thought to have magical ancestors. And there are numerous more examples. It's simply a feature of fantasy. You might criticize it, but assuming that it's secretly criticized in-universe when it's clearly not, is pointless. And it's also simply a feature of fantasy that certain people have traits not found in regular humans, like silver hair and purple eyes. It would not be any different if they instead had blue hair and pronouns. It's simply an aesthetically pleasing combo that is there to set the Valyrians apart from people with more common appearance, while keeping the story on the more realistic side of things, since silver hair and purple eyes might be found in some rare occasions in real life. While the Valyrians themselves were indeed practicing colonialism, theirs was more similar to the colonialism of ancient Rome rather than the one practiced by the British Empire, especially since their slavery was not racialized. And the ancient Romans were certainly not Nazis, though a lot of Nazis have a weird fascination with them. The closest real-life equivalent of the Targaryens was the Ptolemaic dynasty, which also practiced incest, and the Normans that conquered Britain. None of them were Nazis. Since we already established that the conquest of Westeros was not colonialism and claiming so is ignorant and laughable, there could be no Nazi-like Lebensraum for the supposed Nazi Targaryens. And if there were, then they were doing a terrible job and did not unleash even a fraction of the terror that the real Nazis unleashed on the territories they occupied. They did not expel anyone to make way for Valyrian settlers. They did not kidnap children for forced Valyrianization. They kept marrying those they should consider subhuman. They did not exterminate any of the local populations. They did not limit the rights of the native people to speak their language, practice their culture, or worship their religion. They did not terrorize the populations with pacifications. They did not mark entire ethnic groups for genocide. They did not run death camps. They were not confiscating the land and property of the native populations. All the so-called links towards Nazism that Targaryens have are purely circumstantial, a result of bad understanding of Nazism and applying it to realities where it cannot be applied. The Valyrian Empire is clearly Roman-inspired, while the Targaryens themselves are Ptolemaic-inspired. Using ideologies that slaughtered millions of people to win a fan war against blonde elves is not only ignorant, but also disgusting and disrespectful, spitting into the faces of the survivors of its atrocities and their descendants. Any and all people who make such claims should not only be opposed, but preferably deplatformed. Unfortunately, considering how popular these arguments are, it's not going to happen. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video.